Okay, so this video is going to be pretty much about like periodization and the primary role that periodization will ever play within the context of any given program. First, we're going to cover like how not to do periodization, and this kind of gets into a little bit more classical periodization and how it used to be done. And it's also, a lot of people still do it this way out of a misunderstanding of what periodization is. In particular, when people start talking about block periodization, it's implemented in this fashion, which I'm about to describe. So a lot of people will say, okay, like block periodization, I read somewhere that you need to develop this big base of fitness, and I'm going to do all these random exercises and do all this metabolic conditioning stuff and all these like circuits and whatever else, it's a circus act. And then it's okay, and then they use that to develop their base. And then once they do that, then it's okay, well, now I need to do hypertrophy. So then they'll transition to all this like hypertrophy and or strength work, and they'll do a bunch of that, and then they'll go and then they'll quit doing all the hypertrophy work, and then they'll go into a bunch of like speed development, for example. And they'll quit all the Metcon work, they'll quit all the hypertrophy work. And then the problem is every time they move into the next phase, or they rapidly change the goals from one outcome to another, they end up losing a good portion of, if not all the progress of all the stuff of whatever they developed in the previous phase, and they quit doing it. And then whenever they return back to say like, oh, I did my hypertrophy or strength block, 6 months ago, and in the meantime, I've only done cardio and speed work, and then they go back to another hypertrophy block, and it's like, well, in the meantime, you lost, maybe you put on, 4 or 5 pounds of muscle during that, hypertrophy block that was several months long, for example, and you've lost almost all of it by the time you return back to another hypertrophy block. So then you have to spend all the time basically regaining what you'd already lost. So a lot of times we start talking about like phases of programming, and you see this a lot with like newer trainers too. You should never make these wild switches in programming. And you see this a lot with people, like general development programs. With general development programs, a lot of times you're trying to satisfy at the end of the day, like general population training is a fair bit challenging because you're trying to check a lot of boxes for a lot of these people that are fairly diverse. It's not so much where you're training an athlete who's in a niche sport and you can dump 90% of your training time into a high level of development and 1 or 2 specific goals. It gets a little bit harder, especially when you get into the general development population, especially people that are kind of at the higher end of general development, especially like with the military. Military personnel are probably, at the end of the day, they're probably at the highest level of general development where you have to be like pretty strong, have a pretty good aerobic base. You're not necessarily great at any one of those things, but you gotta be like fairly good at all of them. And it can become fairly difficult to balance out your training amongst all these different things and still see a reasonable amount of progress. And sometimes the temptation can be to we'll just stop doing one of these types of training and just dump all that training time into another attribute. Well, the problem is you run into a detraining problem where whatever progress you had, you start losing a bunch of it, and then the next time you return to it, you got to start regaining it again. So one of the things about training that's essential to understand is that it's a lot easier to maintain some ability to do something than it is to make further progress in something, especially when you're trying to reach some new personal best. A lot of times, so this is kind of why it makes it easy to never have to completely eliminate something from the training. It's like you can you can reduce your training volume in something by 80 to 90% and bump your intensity up a little bit. And you'll maintain your capacity to do something, especially if you're not competing at like a world-class level, fairly well, and you can just put that training into other stuff. The problem is when you quit doing something entirely, that detraining can happen fairly quickly. The big challenge with general development programs is that because your training volume is spread amongst so many different goals, sometimes it can be hard to consolidate enough training stress into those goals to see continued progress in all of them at the same time. So in those cases, this happens as you start to get to higher levels of development, where sometimes you got to take some of your training time, you got to start consolidating into 1 or 2 goals at a time, and then just keep the other ones on maintenance. You don't quit doing them, you just do enough of it to maintain your current capacity in them. So what that might look like is, let's say someone's already training 6 days a week, and they have their strength and their speed training, their cardiovascular training, etc. And in this case, it's kind of one of those where you're training 6 days a week or more, and you're training every day. And it may not always make sense to just increase the amount of time that they spend training. This is one of those cases where like you may, especially if you're already doing 2 or more days a week of endurance training, you may run into issues of recovery between all your strength training workouts. So in these cases, like let's say you want to focus a little bit more on your endurance training. So in these cases, you start off with small amounts of it. So maybe at the end of your strength sessions, maybe you just add in like 10 minutes of cardio. Or on your actual cardio sessions, you really focus on increasing the number of miles or the distance that you're moving. So if prior to that, you were running, 10 miles a week or something like that, maybe every week now, you start adding in half a mile kind of deal. And you do that for a few months. And basically what you do is you start adding in volume to your cardiovascular training until you start seeing performance improvements again. And what you do during that time is you're not going to try to increase the difficulty of your strength training workouts. You're just going to hold everything the same as what it is, and you're just going to hold there. And what that does is, by not trying to increase everything at the same time, any additional increases in general work capacity, you can dump that into something that's very taxing on work capacity, like your aerobic training. Whereas like if you start increasing all your aerobic training volume and then you're also trying to increase, say, the difficulty of your strength training workouts, you might start running into issues of recovery, or you start running into increased risks of injury kind of deal. Likewise, if you're to do the opposite and you want to focus a little bit more on hypertrophy and muscle mass, in those cases you might just start slowly adding in, a set at a time. It's like, okay, like just add in 1 set to your strength training sessions at a time, until you start seeing progress again. And then you reduce your cardio only as much as is necessary to facilitate, adding in a set every workout. So when you start running at a time, like, oh, okay, like I don't have enough time to do the cardio at the end of my session, and that's where you make those small changes. You don't just eliminate cardio entirely from your training session. Likewise, like another way to kind of implement block periodization too is if you have an overall training program, so let's say you have like your general development program, and let's say you just kind of want to move into like a hypertrophy phase, for example. And this is kind of where like you can kind of almost see where like hypertrophy and like aerobic conditioning can kind of go together in a program. So these kinds of programs, you don't necessarily increase the amount of time you spend training. You certainly don't increase the intensity that you're training at. Like you're never going to add more weight to the bar. What you're going to do is you're going to focus on, during the time that you spend training, you're going to try to get more total reps at the weights that you're already training at. So you're just trying to increase your training density. And granted, it's going to take a long time. You're going to spend weeks or months in this phase where you're really focusing on decreasing your rest periods and trying to get more overall work during every session. For your aerobic sessions, you're really focused on increasing the total distance that you're moving. Because this is assuming like you're already capped out on your overall training time. Whereas like alternatively, if it's like a strength block, you're not going to try to increase the total number of reps you're doing. Now you're going to focus on just adding weight to the bar over a period of several months. And this would be like a strength phase. And even on kind of a little bit, if you're going to be a little more aggressive on your strength phase, you might even allow your total volume to drop a little bit so as you can still continue to add weight to the bar. So those are kind of ways to implement like actual a little bit of a block periodization approach where you're making these really small adjustments to your programming, and those adjustments to your programming can occur over a period of months or even a year. You might spend a year in a hypertrophy phase where you're really focused on like, okay, like I'm lifting at 70% of my 1 rep max from my training weights, for example, but you keep the absolute load on the bar the same, but you're going to try to get more total reps within the context of the weight that you're already using. And you do that for a year. Maybe over the course of a year, you might increase your total training volume during those workouts by 50+%. And once you kind of reach a point of diminishing returns, or where your rest periods are fairly short, there's not much additional benefit to trying to increase your work capacity anymore. Now you can focus, on a strength block for the next several months. So those are kind of ways to like implement some block periodization, but like the changes to your programming can be fairly small with those kinds of things. A lot of times you're just simply changing the progression variable of your program, and you're keeping everything else constant. The thing to avoid is doing these wild, crazy changes in your programming that just like wildly, and then you have these periods where you're detraining, and then you spend all your time, like developing some attribute, and then you shift to a different attribute, and then you lose all the progress you developed in the last one. And then by the time you circle back to it, you spend all your time just regaining the lost gains, and you don't spend any time actually setting new personal records or developing yourself further. So anyways, that's kind of like how, ways to run programming kind of from a longer term, perspective that can kind of set you up for success. So that's all I got for periodization for now. I'll see you guys later.